Thanks very much, Enrique. The title of the paper that you got in the pack is slightly different from the one that's on, well, it's different from the one that's on the programme. The title in the pack is Can We Flourish Without Addressing the Past? But I think probably what happened was that I wanted to think about, well, what would be a topic for this session, and criminal justice love, thinking a critical relation would have been one, but actually the paper that I'm talking to addresses that title, but through its own title and through its own argument, which is this idea of flourishing without addressing the past. So the paper is about criminal justice and love, and thinking through the critical relation by thinking about issues of flourishing and forgiveness and love in a particular setting and in relation to particular dialogue. So let me just begin by saying something about the overall concerns of the paper and how it's set up. So its overall concerns. Its overall concern is, well, I've been thinking and interested for a time in the issue of transitions from states of trauma in the so-called sphere of transitional justice. The ways in which, in different settings, throughout the world, of course the famous one is South Africa, but we can think also of contexts like Colombia and Chile, and in the UK we have the north of Ireland. Situations where we have societies that have gone through really traumatic phases, and they are in some way or another changing, transiting from them. And my question really was, well, in that kind of setting, which is a different kind of setting from your standard municipal or national criminal justice setting, what kind of role do issues of guilt, forgiveness, responsibility, what kind of role do those play in this very different setting? Because I've spent a lot of time thinking about national criminal justice systems, a formal system of law, and that, I think that takes you in certain directions, but I wanted to look at something different where in a way one thing that happens in these settings is that there's a bit of an inversion really, in that often it is the state that is the criminal, and it is the victim is the state is the perpetrator, and the victim is someone who has experienced trauma at the hands of the state. And in that kind of setting, I think it's quite interesting to think about issues of trauma and forgiveness, and the sense of pain that is and violation that is in crime in a different way than in a normal criminal justice system. The main thought is that you can't get away from thinking about violation in these settings, and violations have to be dealt with. They can't just be brushed under the carpet or swept aside in favour of a transition to a supposedly better condition, social and political condition. And the example that I take in this paper is an example from the UK, which is the example of a woman called Jo Berry. Jo Berry was the daughter of a Conservative government minister in the Thatcher government, Sir Anthony Berry, and he was blown up. He was killed in the IRA set a bomb in 1984 to blow up Mrs. Thatcher, and they didn't succeed in killing her, but they did kill a number of people, and one of them was Sir Anthony Berry. Now the thing about this was that after his death, Jo Berry decided somehow that the only way that she could deal with what had happened to her as the victim of this bombing was if she could in some way turn it to a positive effect. And Pat Magee was one of the bombers, He was caught and he was sent to prison for a number of years. And when he got out in the late 90s, Joe Berry made contact with him, and they developed quite a close dialogic, to use that word, relationship, which is the sort of the ultimate focus of this paper. And what I was really trying to do in thinking about Joe Berry and Pat Magee was I was trying to think, well, how do they actually address these issues of responsibility and blame and guilt and forgiveness in a really very practical and emotional context of how they've come together. Now, the thing about it was, and the three parts of the paper, let me just say what the three parts of the paper are. And the three parts of the paper are, the first part is where I explain where I'm coming from on this, and this is early-ish work in thinking through these issues. But I've been working on it in a variety of ways. I've been thinking about guilt and love, as I said yesterday, and also thinking about psychoanalysis. So I'm trying to find a way of putting these things together, and that's what the first part of the paper does. And then the second part of the paper takes the recent book by Martha Nussbaum that we've mentioned on a couple of occasions these last 2 days. Martha Nussbaum's book on anger and forgiveness. And she has this notion of the need for, in a way she downplays anger, as Latika was saying yesterday. She downplays anger. She doesn't say it doesn't happen, but it should be a trigger to what she calls the transition. And the transition is with a capital T, the transition. And the whole panoply of guilt, responsibility, forgiveness, she sees that as being really not the way to go. That what we need to look to have a better world, either in utilitarian or welfare terms. We need the world to be a better place, and we ought not to let the past get in the way of that. So all those kinds of things that the law has, like guilt, like punishment, responsibility, all these things are what she calls transactional. And she contrasts transitions with transactions. And she says that she's in favour of transitions, the transition, but the transactions are not so important. They're and can be quite problematic. And what I'm trying to do in this paper is to say that if we're going to have transitions, then we can't have them without transactions. So we can't have transitions, we can't make the world better without dealing transactionally with the past. And so the two need to go together. Now when we come to look at Joe Berry and Pat Magee and what they have to say about their relationship, it looks to begin with like Martha Nussbaum's got it right and I've got it wrong, because Joe Berry's initial thoughts are along the lines of, well, it's not an issue of forgiveness of any kind, it's an issue of unconditional love. And that's important. It's only once we express unconditional love that we can move forward. And that's really Martha Nussbaum's point, because she says that what underlies transition is a sense of, we just have to forgive and forget. More than forgiving, we have to really give up on forgiving in favour of a metaphysical status of unconditional love. Now, in my paper, I've got unconditional love there, but I want to see that as related to action in the world, in the sense that unconditional love must be linked to unconditional forgiveness, but then also linked to conditional forgiveness, so that the transactions that we participate in are related to the possibility of the transitions that will then occur. That's roughly the flow of the argument. So let me begin by saying something about how I've come to where I've got to. And this sort of recapitulate something what I said at the very end of my talk yesterday morning. So basically, I start with the idea of guilt, and some of you will have heard me talk about the idea of metaphysical guilt before. It's an idea that I pick up from Primo Levi, but in philosophical terms from Karl Jaspers, who wrote about metaphysical guilt in the wake of the Second World War. And Levi's very, very fascinating, I think, because in a way what Jaspers saw as being a crucial element in thinking about the idea of guilt, philosophically, Levi just felt experientially. It came to Levi experientially. He explains in The Drowned and the Saved, one of his books that came out of his experience in the war, in the concentration camps. He explains there how he experienced this sense of guilt, which in terms very similar to Jaspers had expressed philosophically. So Jaspers talks about a lack of absolute solidarity with the human being as such. So an idea of absolute solidarity with the human being as such. An indelible claim beyond morally meaningful duty. So we've got morally meaningful duty, we've got a deeper level, which is a level of absolute solidarity with the human being. Somewhere among men that the unconditional prevails, the capacity to live only together or not at all. And Levi said something similar. He talked about the demand for solidarity, for a human word, advice, even only a listening ear. And that demand for solidarity was permanent and universal, but rarely satisfied. In the camps, people cried out for solidarity, but it was always there, the cry, but it was rarely heard. And this was the source of the survivor's guilt. Now, so what I was trying to think about was, in a way, that this idea of a world that's beyond ethics, a world in which, to take a description from the Rwandan genocide, David Cesarani describes thinking about that as where every man becomes a genocidal killer. It's a world where there is no ethical hope whatsoever. And what I was trying to do in drawing upon, and this in a way replicates something that Hannah Arendt had said around the problem of German war guilt, around the problem of Adolf Eichmann. So what I was trying to get at was some way of understanding why there might still be a place for guilt in a world that seemed to exist and operate on premises that lacked any sense of morality. And you needed to go to a deeper level, to the metaphysical level, to get to that, I felt. And I felt that Jaspers gave me that inroad, and it was kind of justified or grounded in the real experience of Primo Levi in the camp. So it's a meta-reality, if you like, in terms of the critical realist language. It's a meta-reality, but it's a reality that's grounded in the world, in experience in the world. That then leads me on to the idea of love, which is linked to this. And I've recently worked on the idea of love, developing what it means to love. It's an extended review of a book by a man called Christian Smith, called To Flourish or Destruct. And I look there at love in two ways. One way is just that kind of, is linked to the idea of metaphysical guilt. It's the idea of, this links again with the idea of meta-reality. It's the idea of an unconditional love, a form of love that spreads out from love of self to love of another, to love of all human beings in the world, to love of the species, to love of all other species, and to love as the source or sustaining power in creation itself, and to which we often attach the name God, but I don't think you need to attach the name God to it. You could have a godless sense of love in this sense of a universal love in the world. And I link that idea, that sort of Bhaskarian idea, up with the idea of a metaphysics of guilt. Because if you like, the metaphysics of guilt is when we fall short in terms of the metaphysics of love. We feel guilt precisely because we refuse the claim of the other. We refuse the request for solidarity with the other. So that's one route into thinking about that, one link to love. And the other route to love is the psychoanalytic route. And here I draw on the philosophy of Jonathan Lear and Jessica Benjamin and also Melanie Klein, to think about love as the libidinous drive and the emotional relation that gets us going as people, and that provides us with the gift of our individuation, ultimately provides us with the gift of our individuation and personhood through loving recognition by another. And that's a story that starts with the depressive phase in Melanie Klein's analysis that Craig spoke about yesterday, but also takes me into Jessica Benjamin's feminist psychoanalysis from the 1980s. Now I think the thought is that these things all can go together, but I want to develop that second aspect. We've got the sense of a metaphysical guilt at one level, and we've got the sense of a kind of a human level of love, and I need to think about at the human level, at the psychoanalytic level of love, how that comes out of guilt as well. But like I said yesterday, the analogy, the metaphor would be with the grain of sand, the universe that is in the grain of sand, and so this unique and small, but ultimately very large connection that the infant, the child, the baby has with its parent is, in a sense, at the core of the universal sense of love. They're the micro and the macro of the same thing. But I need to say a little bit more about guilt coming out of the psychoanalytic analysis. And in that I start with Melanie Klein, and the basic argument that in the primary narcissistic phase, there's an intense anger that the infant feels and expresses when things aren't going well. The infant is hungry, uncomfortable, and it translates that into a fear. It translates that, so it has this narcissistic anger, which so there's love. There's the sense of well-being and love, and then there's anger, and these things are not at all in phase with each other, and there's a fear. The narcissistic fear is that through the anger one will have damaged the thing that one is angry about, i.e. the parent, and yet the parent is the object that is loved. So there's a tremendous kind of conflict in the baby, which comes out in Klein's analysis as an anxiety that you've hurt the thing that you love, and that guilt is really the conflict, and it is a conflict and a tension between what we would deeply wish for an object of our love and a fear that we may have damaged that object. So that's the starting point. There's some kind of sense of guilt within us in our most basic dealings with the world. Now, I use Jessica Benjamin's work to expand on that, to sort of give it a bit more of a framing that could allow us to think about how we might think about guilt in our relationships with other people and not in the parent-child bond. I mean, Benjamin's work is, I think, fascinating, and in a way, she has a way, I think, of resolving the Hegel's dialectic of recognition in a way that's potentially much more satisfactory than that unsatisfactory conclusion to the master-slave dialectic in Hegel's phenomenology. And her idea there is that she draws upon the master-slave relation, but she says that recognition that in good parenting there is a successful individuation of the parent from the child and the child from the parent. This is a successful, and that individuation of the child is a successful recognition. And of course that's where things go well, because things can go badly in the parent-child relationship. But where they go well, there is successful recognition and this successful individuation of the child. And that creates a kind of tensed space between the two, such that the parent's recognition of the child as another person gives that child the space to be itself, and it invokes in the child a counter recognition that the parent too is an individual. So only if the parent is herself accepted as an individual can her recognition of the child enable it to act independently as an individual in its own right. But there's a tension there. There's a constant need to monitor that, and it can go very badly wrong. So the parent can become dominant, or in the case of His Majesty the baby, the child can become dominant. Either the parent or child can become dominant, and that can really affect things there. So there's a play of recognition, and essentially what I suggest is that play of recognition is then the thing that one can think of as being the thing that lies behind feelings of guilt that one might have in relation to things done to other people in the world, and not just in the parent-child relationship. So the starting point there with thinking about guilt. And then I want to, so I've given some kind of ethical foundation for guilt in both a metaphysical and a psychoanalytic context, and as a real experience. Now that then takes me on to Nussbaum's work. I think I'm putting into slightly more than 5 minutes. Is that okay? I'll try and be as quick as I can.
Still 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So, as I said, with Nussbaum, so Nussbaum's work is about forgiveness rather than guilt, but guilt and forgiveness are really part of the same setting, if you like, because in the ways in which we think about this, if you have guilt, then one of the ways of avoiding guilt is through forgiveness. But Nussbaum says, well, I don't want to go down that route. I don't want to talk about guilt and forgiveness and all that stuff, because that's really what she calls conditional forgiveness. You know, because you've done this, I'll do that. And she says that that's ultimately that's kind of punishing. It's not really forgiving. It's in a sense latently punishing. And she gives the example of the parable of the son, the prodigal. That was the word I was thinking for. Thanks. She gives the parable of the prodigal son, who comes home, and the father goes out and embraces the son, and won't hear any kind of request for forgiveness from him. It's enough that he's come home. And she says that's the way in which the world should be. That's the model for that's the model for the transition, that we should have a sense of unconditional love. Anger should simply be a sign for a transition to a setting of unconditional love and transition to a better world, and give up on all these thoughts of culpability and blame leading to responsibility and forgiveness and so on, and guilt. Now I think that to me is too short. It seems to me that you know, just to take the example of the prodigal son, you know, it seems to me that any parent in that setting would not really be truly loving their child if they didn't say to them that, well, you know, you're very welcome back here, but I have to say that what you've done is not really right. You know, you shouldn't really have done what you did, and it behoves me as your parent to say that to you. And by the way, I think that any parent who is behaving badly towards a child is equally entitled to be addressed in that way. And that has nothing to do with there not being a setting of unconditional love, but rather that love and dialogue should, in these settings, be together rather than apart. So you need a transaction as well as a transition. You need a transaction as well as unconditional love. And that brings me on to the final part, and I'll just try and wrap this up in 2 or 3 minutes. It's Joe Berry and Patrick Magee. So now here's something that she says. She says that, this is talking about Magee. She says, an inner shift is required to hear the story of the enemy. For me, the question is always about whether I can let go of the need to blame and open my heart enough to hear Patrick's story and understand his emotions. The truth is, sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. Now I don't talk about forgiveness. To say I forgive you is almost condescending. It locks you into an us and them scenario, keeping me right and you wrong. This is essentially Nussbaum's point. But I can experience empathy, and in that moment there's no judgment. Sometimes when I've met with Patrick, I've had such a clear understanding of his life that there's nothing to forgive. I wanted to meet Patrick to put a face to the enemy and to see him as a real human being. I feel I've been recovering some of the humanity I lost when that bomb went off. I've realised that no matter which side of the conflict you're on, had we all lived each other's lives, we could all have done what the other did. I could easily have made the same choices Patrick made. Now, if I were Martha Nussbaum, I would be saying, oh, this completely makes my point for me. But of course, it's not the point that I want to make. So I then need to think about, well, how do I reflect on that? And I think my answer is that it lies in the first 3 lines of what she says. She says, an inner shift is required to hear the story of the enemy. For me, the question is always about whether I can let go of the need to blame and open my heart enough to hear Patrick's story and understand his motivations. The truth is that sometimes I can and sometimes I can't. Now, from Nussbaum's point of view, she might say, well, you know, Joe's problem is that she hasn't got properly to the transition yet. She let go of that. But my sort of counter-argument to that would be, well, no, that should be exactly where she's at. She should be in a place where she feels all sorts of conflicted emotions about this man, many of which will be based around needs to blame, to hold responsible, to find culpable, and so on, as well as that other side, which is the universal side in her, which is very powerful. But why should that be the only side? And especially when you hear what Patrick Magee has to say in relation to his conversations with her. This is my last point. So he says, Magee's position is this. He says, someday I may be able to forgive myself, although I still stand by my actions, because at the time we were trapped and there was no other way. I will always carry the burden that I harmed other human beings, but I'm not seeking forgiveness. If Joe could just understand why someone like me could get involved in the armed struggle, then something has been achieved. Between Joe and me, the big issue is the use of violence. I can't claim to have renounced violence. Now, he's in a very split position. He's saying what I did was justified in the situation of the Irish struggle for against the Ulster state. We were entitled to take to arms, but I feel really bad about it. That's what he's saying. So he's not saying what I did was wrong. So he's saying I'm not asking for forgiveness. At the same time as he's saying, at some point I may be able to forgive myself. So I'm not looking for forgiveness, and at some point there's a real conflict in what he's saying, in the message that he's giving. And I think in that setting, that's a dialogue, that's a broken dialogue. It's a broken dialogue between Joe and Pat. It's a dialogue that can't be transactional in the right kind of way, because he's not asking her for forgiveness. So the dialogue stops at one place. It's a dialogue at one level, it's a dialogue of the morally deaf, and yet it's a dialogue that is of the morally good at the same time. And it's for that reason, I think, that one might think, it might make a difference to her if he was asking for forgiveness. And until he does, then why shouldn't she feel that part of her just is angry and blaming for the things that she's experienced and suffered in this world, despite whatever her metaphysical and loving feelings may be. So that's my argument for saying, that's how I interpret that piece, as a way of saying that transitions are about transactions and that unconditional love doesn't come alone. Thank you.